From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, I'm Carla Gonzalez, and this is From the South. We start in Venezuela, where election campaigns are coming to an end. The three main presidential candidates have been taking their message across the country, while the opposition parties calling for a boycott of Sunday's elections have become increasingly isolated. Ian Bruce reports.
On the penultimate day of campaigning, President Maduro was at opposite ends of the country, here in Bolívar in the east, later in Zulia in the west, before his closing.
Let's go now to Ian Bruce live from Caracas, and we'll go back to that story as soon as we have it. Hello, Ian. What are we expecting today as candidates are closing their campaigns?
Yes, indeed, Carla. The last day of campaigning ahead of Sunday's election. From midnight, there will be no more campaigning. The so-called electoral silence will come into force until the end of voting on Sunday. Before that, both the main candidates will be holding their closing rallies. President Nicolas Maduro here in Caracas. As I drove into work this morning, the main avenue, Esplanade, going into the center of Caracas, the Avenida Bolívar, had already been closed off for that rally and march. The main opposition candidate, Henry Falcón, will be holding his closing rally probably an hour or two earlier this afternoon in his home state of Lara, in the capital city Barquisimeto, where he's already been twice governor and twice mayor. The third place candidate Javier Bertucci, held his closing rally yesterday in Valencia, and interestingly he didn't respond to Henry Falcón's call on him yesterday to assume his responsibilities and join forces with Henry Falcón to try and defeat President Maduro. Before all of that, we are expecting this morning the beginning of the International Observer Mission. There'll be a formal event to inaugurate that mission. Most of the international observers have been arriving over the last couple of days. So yeah, it's an important day and quite an emotional day at the end of this campaign.
Another event going on in Venezuela. There was a disturbance at the prison in Helicoide. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, Carla, this is quite interesting and important because it kind of feeds into the election campaign. There was this disturbance yesterday, lasted several hours, began in the morning, apparently. Now, I should explain, the Helicoide is the headquarters of the Venezuelan intelligence service. They've been very imposing horseshoe-shaped building on a hill very close to the center of Caracas, and it includes a detention center where there are both common prisoners and some of the political figures who were arrested and accused of being directly involved or organizing the violence during opposition protests last year that resulted in the death of over 100 people. Now, it began with the common prisoners, this disturbance, although it seems to be relatively peaceful. As far as we know, only one person was injured. But then a lot of those political figures joined in. They had access to social media and they were tweeting and sending out videos denouncing their detention and the conditions in which they're detained. The US Embassy joined in, sending out messages because there's one US citizen who was also arrested for his alleged involvement in that violence last year. So I mean, we don't have a lot of details, apart from the fact that it's been brought under control. The Attorney General, Tarek William Saab, has ordered an investigation into exactly what happened. But certainly one interpretation from the Chavista side, and I say it's only an interpretation, is that this was either exploited by, taken advantage of by, or even organized by the more hardline elements of the opposition, precisely because they've had considerable difficulty making their presence felt during this campaign. They've been calling for a boycott. That doesn't seem to be a very popular position, even amongst many of their own supporters, because yesterday they tried to hold their main protest against the election, alleging which they say will be fraudulent, but really the turnout was quite small, only a few hundred, possibly 1,000 people. So that also fed in, that's kind of fed into the election campaign mood as well.
Thank you very much, Ian. We'll be sure to follow up on everything that happens in Venezuela. So the Canadian government has said to Venezuela it will not authorize the installations of polling stations in their country for Sunday's vote. Foreign Minister Jorge Arreaza is condemning this move. He said the government of Canada is violating the rights of the 5,000 Venezuelans who want to vote in that country. The Venezuelan government has already distributed voting materials to all embassies and consulates to guarantee the electoral process.
Canada
is not happy with all these sanctions applied against even more Venezuelans than the US government. So in a statement they declare that they won't allow Venezuela's government to install polling stations in our embassy and consulates in their country.
Now let's go to Colombia, where the presidential candidate Gustavo Petro is winding up his election campaign in the capital city, Bogotá. Petro will give a final speech in the central square, the Plaza de Simón Bolívar. He will make a call for hope, social justice, a productive economy, education for the campesinos, and for peace. According to the latest polls, the Colombia Humana candidate is neck to neck with his main opponent, right-wing candidate Iván Duque. Colombians will vote on May 27. And we continue in Colombia, where tens of thousands of people had to evacuate their homes after heavy flooding of the Cauca River at Colombia's largest hydroelectric project. The flooding demolished 63 houses, a clinic, 2 schools, and 2 bridges, and has left around 600 people homeless near the northwestern district of Ituango. The flooding was mainly caused by the clearing of one of the tunnels at the dam construction site. The dam is already controversial, as relatives of those that have disappeared in the area say it will erase the bodies of the victims buried by paramilitary groups. Let's go to Ecuador, where former ministers Patricio Zambrano and Cesar Navas explained to the National Assembly their actions on the case of the journalist team kidnapped and murdered on the border with Colombia. The session was private and was only to be attended by the relatives of the dead journalist and the driver. Lawmakers of the Citizen Revolution Group are now demanding the session to be made open to the public. They also ask for further investigations on what really happened.
Given, there was no need to make it a confidential issue. That's why us, the lawmakers of the Citizens Revolution Group, have decided to start a political trial, which would involve the former Interior and Defense Ministers and the Foreign Minister María Fernanda Espinosa.
Argentina's President Mauricio Macri says his country has overcome the currency crisis as prices for stocks and bonds rose. Macri called on his administration to quicken the pace of its deficit-cutting program. This announcement came after the government began negotiations with the International Monetary Fund, or IMF. Argentina is waiting to see what measures will be required by the IMF in exchange for this financing deal, which is being negotiated in Washington.
We believe that the turbulence over the exchange rate has been overcome, but we consider that it's important, very important, to recognize all the anxiety that various sectors of the population have experienced.
Meanwhile, hundreds of people marched in Buenos Aires to reject Macri's economic measures. They are also demanding better actions against high inflation. Our correspondent in Buenos Aires, Edgardo Esteban, has more.
Public workers, social movements, and pensioners have mobilized to the streets of Buenos Aires to demand the government of Mauricio Macri increase salaries and take action against high inflation, which increased 10% in the last 4 months, making basic goods difficult to afford, especially for people with less income. Protesters also rejected the negotiations between the government and the IMF after the bad economic experiences of the past, which brought a major economic crisis affecting the poorest sector of the country.
That was Edgardo Esteban from Buenos Aires. Let's go back to that report that we were talking about the end of the campaigns in Venezuela.
On the penultimate day of campaigning, President Maduro was at opposite ends of the country, here in Bolívar in the east, later in Zulia in the west, before his closing rally in Caracas on Thursday.
Venezuela es un país democrático.
Venezuela is a totally democratic country, and that's not new. In the 19 years of revolution, we've had 23 elections. Sundays will be the 24th. Elections for governors, mayors, presidents, referendums, assembly elections, and so on, all with an impeccable electoral system.
The main opposition candidate, Henry Falcón, dropped a bombshell as he took his campaign to Yaracuy. He offered a cabinet post to Enrique Capriles, leader of the biggest party, calling for a boycott of Sunday's election.
We have a lot of agreements. I hope Enrique Capriles can be the next Minister of the Interior and Justice. He would have an excellent relationship with the governors and mayors.
The divisions within Venezuela's traditional opposition have taken a heavy toll on their level of support. This was the main protest called ahead of the election by the pro-abstention parties.
The numbers here are not huge. They're a little bit spread out, so it's difficult to be precise. A few hundred certainly, possibly 1,000, not more than that. Now that's a great deal fewer people than the opposition was able to mobilize 1 year, 2 years, 3 years ago when they began their campaign to try and bring down the Bolivarian government. But this does seem to show that at least a part of the opposition support base is not happy with the abstention position, and they've decided to migrate and support the main candidate, opposition candidate who is standing in this election, Henry Falcón, and some of them, of course, Javier Bertucci as well, the third place candidate.
Bertucci has been closing his campaign in Valencia. Henry Falcón again called on him to assume his responsibilities before the country and join forces to defeat President Maduro. Ian Bruce, Telesur, Caracas.
We're taking a short break now, but join us after this video from our multimedia team. In Nicaragua, talks to end violence have been marked by strong disagreements between student groups and President Daniel Ortega. In the first session on Wednesday, the Catholic Church called for understanding between the parties. Negotiators include the government, private sector, and student organizations.
I ask you, Mr. President, all of us have one thing in common, the only thing that has brought us all together, which is our country, Nicaragua. I suggest that you rethink with your cabinet the path you have taken. I say this with pain. An unarmed revolution has begun.
For more on these talks, we go to our correspondent Maria Jose Diaz in Managua.
The first session saw a very tense environment at the opening of the national dialogue. Some parties, including the Catholic Church, have called on President Daniel Ortega to immediately stop all police repression and want armed police units to be withdrawn from the streets. In response, President Ortega quoted a message from the Episcopal Conference in which all sectors were called on to avoid violence. However, violent acts committed by the opposition groups have continued, resulting in killings and damage to the public and private property, as well as looting. President Ortega reaffirmed that the police has been instructed not to shoot, but they are still responsible for maintaining order. He also said that the people have called for justice and for conditions to return to normal, so that they can travel and work safely. His exact words were, "Stop killing Nicaragua, as you have been doing. No matter what, your religion or your political ideology, no more blood from our brothers and sisters should be spilled." President Ortega also thanked the Episcopal Conference for their extraordinary effort in hosting and mediating these national dialogue sessions. But on the other hand, the Catholic Church has asked for all involved in the violence to send a clear message so all can come to an agreement and everything can be in place for them to start working towards Nicaragua's peace agreement next Friday.
That was Maria Jose Diaz from Nicaragua. In Chile, around 20,000 people marched in the streets of Santiago to demand a university environment free of sexism, harassment, and sexual abuse. They gathered in front of the Congress to call for university directors to foster programs that promote equality and mutual respect on campus. The protests ended in clashes with the police that used water cannons and tear gas to disperse the crowds. Since last week, students have occupied different Chilean universities to denounce sexual harassment and violence by teachers.
We're marching because we want to stop to the violence as well as the sexist and stereotypical speech that is being heard in the classrooms.
On May 18, the world celebrates the 11th annual Day Against Homophobia and Transphobia. Cuba has been holding a series of events since May 4th. For the second year in a row, there are calls to end homophobia and transphobia in schools. Our correspondent in Havana, Laura Prada, tells us more.
Alba is a Colombian modern activist for girls and boys who are discriminated against and bullied because of their gender identification. She became an activist after her son Sergio Urrego committed suicide after being ostracized in school. She believes schools should teach respect for others without labels.
Creating an educational environment free from discrimination and safe for our children is very important for me. Today, we can see many statistics that show that many of our children take the decision to commit suicide.
The creation of a space for dialogue on activism networks are some of the activities' plans for the Day Against Homophobia and Transphobia. People who attend share their lives' stories. Oscar winner Dani Vega is a supporter of the event.
There
is a good mood, and we are attempting to bring the rights of the LGBTI community to schools, universities, technical training centers, and places that promotes social growth and reflection.
This year's theme again centers its work on creating schools free of discrimination. For 30 years, the National Center for Sexual Education, CENESEX, have been promoting work on topics like gender education and inclusivity, child abuse, therapy, and sexual orientation.
One of the most interesting things of CENESEX's work has been precisely the changes inside their own institution since the 1980s. Of course, handling these changes at a time where national and international issues related to sexual education were not open to debate. So there has been a change from a more scientific point of view to respect gender, identity, and human rights.
Above all, the Cuban Day Against Homophobia and Transphobia hopes to create a more inclusive society. Laura Prada, Telesur Havana.
Women in the Dominican Republic have gathered at the Congress calling for decriminalization of abortion. A delegation handed a letter to lawmakers where they warned that criminalization of abortion is putting the lives, health, and dignity of women at risk. They are calling on public health care providers to allow abortion when the pregnancy is not viable or is the result of rape or incest. Abortion in the Dominican Republic is currently punished with 2 to 3 years in prison for women and 3 to 4 years for the doctors and medical staff involved. In Peru, President Martín Vizcarra has criticized the 14-month suspension for soccer player Paolo Guerrero for alleged doping. The suspension has shaken Peru as the captain and the star might miss the World Cup in Russia.
The 14-month suspension is too much. We are going to support Guerrero. Our Ministry of Foreign Relations and the Embassy of Switzerland can be at his lawyer's disposal, so that the Peruvian state can follow this legal process that is beginning in the Swiss Federal Court.
A magnitude 5.2 earthquake has struck southern Mexico, triggering alarms and evacuation procedures in Mexico City. The tremor, which was centered in the state of Guerrero, was felt in Mexico City as hundreds of people left office blocks and gathered in the streets. The country is still recovering from two large earthquakes that caused widespread damage in September 2017. We'll take one last short break, but join us after this look at what our multimedia colleagues are reporting. Welcome back. The Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of Congo has spread from the countryside to Bandaka City, which has a population of 1 million inhabitants. Health authorities fear this infection will now be difficult to control. 42 people have been infected so far, and 23 have died since March. It is the 9th time Ebola has outbreaking in the country. The worst Ebola epidemic in West Africa was between 2014 and 2016. It killed more than 11,000 people and infected over 28,000 across Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. To fight the new outbreak, the World Health Organization has sent this week more than 8,000 batches of a new experimental vaccine to the DRC.
This is not a general vaccination, this is really targeted vaccination for those who are identified as being at risk, and this includes obviously health workers and first responders. When it comes to the vaccines, WHO is working with the Ministry of Health, Gavi, MSF and other partners to conduct vaccination of high-risk population in the affected health zones as early as possible.
A referendum in Burundi will decide if the president will rule until 2034. Here's more on that story and other ones making headlines around the world.
Burundi is voting in a referendum on constitutional changes that could extend the president's rule until 2034. The amendment will extend the presidential term from 5 to 7 years. This would allow President Pierre Nkurunziza to rule for another 14 years. He has been in power since 2005. An estimated 1,200 people have been killed and 400,000 people have fled the country since political unrest began in April 2015, according to the United Nations. New Catalan leader Quim Torra has been sworn in as Catalonia's new leader, bringing an end to 7 months of direct rule of Spanish government. Madrid will lift its intervention once the Catalan government is fully formed and members of cabinet named. Torra is the 7th Catalan leader since Spain returned to democracy in the 1970s.
Promise to fulfill the obligations of the role of President of the Generalitat and to be loyal to the will of the people of Catalonia and the representatives in Catalonia's parliament.
Leaders of the European Union are meeting with the leaders of the Western Balkan countries who want to join the EU in Bulgaria's capital, Sofia. The summit is part of a renewed drive to bring 6 Balkan nations, Albania, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Kosovo, Macedonia, Montenegro and Serbia, closer to the bloc. The EU wants the candidates to root out organized crime and end all bilateral territorial conflicts before becoming members.
The Syrian flag is waving again in Al-Rastan, the 3rd largest city in the region of Homs. The government's Syrian Arab Army regained the city, which was under control of the rebel Free Syrian Army. The government army was welcomed by locals with cheerings and songs in the main square. With the liberation of Al-Rastan, Bashar al-Assad has won a key area in the country. The gain is another step towards the end of the 7-year civil war that has left over 400,000 dead and more than 13 million Syrians in need of humanitarian aid. And with that, we come to the end of this news brief. But this and other stories, as you know, you can find them on our website, telesurtv.net/English. And be sure to follow us also on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Telesur English, I'm Carla Gonzalez. Thank you for watching.